Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. We'll be talking about a crucial development in South Asia that has just taken place. We're talking about Prime Minister Imran Khan, who started his first trip to Iran by landing in Iran's holy city of Mashhad on Sunday night. He visited the shrine of Imam Raza there before moving on to Tehran. Now, this comes at a critical time when Iran and Pakistan relations have been rather tense. In fact, just a day before the Prime Minister's trip, Islamabad lodged a pretty strong protest with Iran regarding the inaction against terror groups believed to be involved in the Ormara massacre. It was a sad incident where 14 Pakistanis were murdered in cold blood on the Balochistan coastal highway. Now, Pakistan says the terrorists who carried out the massacre are allegedly based in Iran and that Iran needs to step up its game and rein them in. The Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif had earlier condemned the Ormara attack. Also, in a post shared on Twitter, in fact, he wrote, and I quote, strongly condemning the recent terrorist attack in Pakistan, just as Prime Minister Imran Khan embarks on his first historic visit to Iran. Now, Pakistan has generally tried to maintain close ties with both Saudi Arabia and Iran, but bitter regional foes that they are between each other, Pakistan has been kind of stuck in the middle and has drifted away from Tehran in the past few years. Now, both countries, Iran and Pakistan, have been accusing each other for backing terrorist groups which are active in both Pakistan and Iran. But relations have generally been on the uptick. So we will be talking to our guests to understand not just the border security, regional issues that are being discussed are on top of the agenda here during the Prime Minister Imran Khan's visit to Iran, and also the finer nuances of the relationship between these two countries. I'd like to welcome my guest here. Mr. Najamuddin Shaikh is the former ambassador to Iran. You are joining us from Karachi. And Mr. Mohammad Marandi, an analyst, joining us from Tehran. Welcome to both of you to Newswire. Let me start with you, Mr. Najamuddin. How do you see and what is the significance to you of Prime Minister Imran Khan's visit to Iran at this point?
Well, I think this visit is long overdue. President Rouhani has been in Pakistan, and a visit by the Prime Minister to Iran was something to be expected, particularly given the fact that this is a country with which we've shared an old relationship, a relationship which became a little strained during a period, but otherwise has always been termed as cordial, and always we've always talked about the fact that there are lots of possibilities in terms of trade and economic collaboration. Those haven't really materialized. We still talk about the fact that we want to raise the volume of trade between the two countries to $5 billion, but that's a long way off. But in the meanwhile, we've been talking to them about importing gas, etc. Again, these are things that have been become slightly more complicated given the sanctions under which the United States has placed Iran, and given the prominent role of the United States in the financial markets, this introduces a complexity which probably will mean that this project will not take off immediately. But I'm mentioning these as indicating that there is a great deal that can be done between Iran and Pakistan, and will be done. Of course, the major thing that we are now looking to is the fact that we have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, we have a good relationship with Iran, and we want the Islamic world to be united rather than divided as it is. I was encouraged by the fact that the Saudis have sent relief goods. Saudis and the UAE have sent relief goods to Iran
during the flood. Absolutely.
Flood.
But please hold that thought. Let me move on to another. Let me get the views of Mr. Marandi here. The Pakistan's Prime Minister's visit to Iran, it comes at a time where there was a lot of tension with India. And there's an escalation and the de-escalation of tensions with India. And now we see him visiting Iran, which prior to this, no such major kind of moves, diplomatic moves were made. What, in your eyes, is the significance of this visit?
Well, Iran and Pakistan have very close cultural ties. They're neighbors, and they have a similar worldview. For example, the Pakistani Prime Minister, he was a friend of Julian Assange, who was recently abducted by the British. So he is critical of Western hegemonic ambitions. I think that it's in Pakistan's interest to establish very close ties with Iran, and it's in Iran's interest to establish very close ties with Pakistan. It's only natural, and it's Iran through Pakistan can export gas, which would alleviate many of the problems in Pakistan, and it would be a huge market for Iran. This is just one example of the many.
One of the things that came up during the press conference held by President Rouhani with Prime Minister Imran Khan was this very mention that a barter committee will be set up so in order to allow both countries to trade, considering the U.S. sanctions. And another point that was raised was that acknowledging that the moves made by the U.S. in the recent past have he called it, inaccurate measures by the U.S., which was insulting the IRGC. Also, they mentioned, Mr. Rouhani mentioned Golan Heights, how the U.S. has acknowledged the annexation of the Golan Heights by the Israelis. But basically, it's a significant mention, don't you think, Mr. Najamuddin, that together on one forum, they are acknowledging a common miscreant which has been in the relations between these two?
Yes, well, you know, with regard to the United States and its position on Iran, I think in one sense, the United States is plowing a lonely furrow, because I don't think the European Union wants to take the path that the Americans have taken. They think that the nuclear deal was a good one. That there are other ways in which there can be discussions between Iran and its Western interlocutors with regard to the fears and apprehensions, and with regard to what is happening in Iran's immediate neighborhood. My own view is that really the exaggeration is quite clear from the fact that Iran's budget, defense budget, is by Western standards or by Western calculations, about $15 billion. The defense budgets of the GCC countries, even if you exclude Qatar and you exclude Kuwait, runs into much more than $100 billion. So why should this apprehension exist, and why should there be this effort at building what the President Trump has called a Middle East security alliance, which is what he's trying to bring about? The fact of the matter is that the subjects you mentioned Golan Heights and these sanctions, these are all really not designed to, or the eventual plan that Jared Kushner is going to present with regard to the Palestinian problem. Right. None of these are things that really are going to be justifiable in terms of the legal situation. Most countries already have condemned the fact that there has been a recognition of Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights, or plans for annexation of the areas in occupied Palestine or the West Bank. But the principal point that we have to look at is that what is the relationship going to be between Pakistan and Iran with regard to these charges of our charge that there are organizations based in Iranian Sistan, Balochistan, which have carried out the attack on at Ormara, and the Iranian charge, despite the fact that of the 27 people who were apparently taken hostage, we were able to rescue and bring back from the Nimruz or the triangle where the three borders meet. We were able to rescue them and hand them over to the Iranians. Now, I know that this distrust is of long standing. It's been prompted in part also by the fact that the Indian spy Kulbhushan Yadav came from across from Iran, and that apparently not much has been done with regard to investigating how he managed to stay there with a false passport.
This is something which is, this is one of the main key topics. One of the key topics were to be discussed here, which was on the agenda, and with Iran was the border issues, this concern of accusations and counter-accusations between the two. Mr. Marandi, how do you see it? Because also I'd like to highlight here in the press conference what President Rouhani highlighted and said specifically that he really appreciates that Prime Minister Imran Khan Pakistan has not allied themselves with any war coalition or military coalition.
Yes, I think that the very fact that the attack in Pakistan took place right before the trip makes us very suspicious. And one would imagine that the natural beneficiary from such an attack would be those who are opposed to Iranian-Pakistan relations. Just as the attacks that were carried out in Iran recently, for example, killing 27 Iranian soldiers, which were carried out through Pakistan, the belief in Tehran is that they were carried out by forces that are hostile towards Iran-Pakistani relations. But again, the leaders of the two countries recognize quite well that we are neighbors. We have very close religious, cultural, and historical relations, and it would be foolish to allow third parties to hinder the expansion of relations between the two countries.
So also, Mr. Najamuddin, there's, like you said, like Mr. Marandi mentioned, they're neighbors, they have mutual interests. One of the interests that Iran has shown continuously, and this is in previous talks with the Taliban also, is Afghanistan. How much of Pakistan and Iran's interests converge and diverge when it comes to Afghanistan?
Well, Afghanistan, I think, has been a source of difficulty rather than cooperation in the past. But now I think that the prospects are that Foreign Minister Zarif and President Rouhani are looking for the fact that there should be peace and stability in Afghanistan. The Iranians have interests in the area around Herat, which is really very, very Persianized, if you will, if you wish to use that term, and have close relations with with their Iranian neighbors, and there has, of course, been a close financial relationship between the last president, President Karzai, and Iran. But right now, Iran has made it clear that they are prepared to play a role. They have organized lots of meetings with the Taliban. The Taliban have met in Iran quite often. So they are looking now, I think, to play a role which should facilitate the dialogue between the Taliban and the Iran.
Thank you so much, Mr. Najamuddin Shaikh, for your time here. Coming back to you, Mr. Marandi, of course, there's also one other mutual interest between the two, and that is the One Belt, One Road initiative.
Yes, without a doubt. And in fact, peace in Afghanistan would contribute to that. The problem for Iran, of course, is the U.S. occupation of the country, that the attempts of the United States to keep the country unstable in order to justify their presence. The mere presence of the United States creates that instability. And the United States itself has been supporting extremist groups across the board, as we saw in Syria and Libya and Yemen, with its regional allied client regimes. But I think that especially with the opportunities that are being created in the region by the gradual U.S. decline, I think that Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Pakistan can create a very important corridor or series of corridors for regional trade and global trade, and thus enhancing their status on the global arena. So there's a lot to talk about between these two leaders. And I think it's very important for both sides to make sure that third parties
it's a really interesting point, Gandhi, that you've introduced here, and I'd like to welcome Mr. Abbas Aslani. He's a journalist from Tehran who's just joining us. Mr. Aslani, something that Mr. Marandi highlighted is that there seems to be, with the US's decline in sort of this overreaching control it's had across the Middle East and South Asian countries, with that decline, we're seeing a shift in these countries and a new kind of political alliance emerging. Would you agree with this?
Well, thank you for having me. In fact, the unilateralism by the United States administration, which is taking place now, has pushed other countries in order to create some alliances in the different parts of the world, including the region. And I think the only solution for the countries who are in the region is to cooperate together, because the region is their home, and nobody from beyond the region can resolve the issues in the country.
You could give us an idea, Mr. Aslani, of what the response has been in Iran, in Tehran, and especially Mashhad, where Prime Minister Imran Khan started his journey. What kind of response has there been from the people of Iran?
I think we can see this issue from two viewpoints. I think paying the visit to Iran by starting to the city of Mashhad is something that indicates that Mr. Imran Khan respects the Shias, and on this issue, this is something welcoming sign to Iranians.
So we are now joined by Mr. Sardar Asif Khan, the former foreign minister, who's joining us here from Lahore. Welcome to Newswire. Mr. Asif Ali, if you could give me your point of view on how you see Prime Minister Khan visiting Iran, and especially keeping in mind that he will next be visiting China for the One Belt, One Road conference. Do you think it's a mere coincidence, or maybe China is playing an important role here in breaking the thaw between the two neighboring countries?
But I think that is already an ongoing process which is already happening. China is a member of BRICS, and so is Iran, so is India, of course. And China is all the time concerned about its fuel security. So it needs the petroleum from Iran. But Iran is now having great difficulty in exporting petroleum to Iran as well as to India. So I think there will be some sort of a readjustment in the relations, at least economic relations, between China and Iran, and as well as India and Iran. So the Indians are very active there. We have found out recently that some of the terrorists were operating from Iran. We have done terrorism in Balochistan recently. And some of the Indian operatives, like Kurbashan, was also operating from Iran. So these are the things that have caused a certain amount of discomfort in Islamabad. So
clearly. But this is something that is being discussed right now as the press conference, a critical press conference that was underway earlier, where brotherly relations between the two countries need to be promoted even more. And Prime Minister Imran Khan also said on the same note that the distance between these two countries need to be reduced, and that also both governments need to come together and make arrangements or confer with each other, so not to allow each other's land be used against each other. He seems to be implying to some third party, referring to a third party using the land against each other. And of course, he's highlighted again the Kashmir issue, Prime Minister Khan saying that once the Kashmir issue is resolved, it would be peace for the entire region, not just for Pakistan and India. It would also affect Iran. Some of these statements came in this press conference that was held earlier. What do you think, Mr. Marandi, that when this, would it be a new chapter that is beginning between the two?
Well, that's the hope. Of course, for the last few decades, there have been constant attempts, as the two leaders have implicitly pointed out, to prevent the two countries from growing close to each other. And again, the countries that are hurt the most by any gap between Iran and Pakistan are indeed Iran and Pakistan. Both countries have enormous populations, they have enormous resources, they are enormous strategic importance, and their firm alliance does more to create security in this part of the world than any other two countries, in my opinion. I think that the fact that the Prime Minister visited Mashhad also itself is not just a message to Iranians or Pakistani Shias. It's basically saying that our cultural similarities, all Muslims across the board in these two countries are so great and so similar that division really are meaningless. Therefore, I'm optimistic about the future, though I think that any major step that is taken to bring the two countries closer to each other will be met with hostility and opposition. But we'll have to see where that opposition and hostility comes from.
Also, Mr. Aslani, another thing that Rouhani mentioned was that we are looking to expand our export of power by 10 times with Pakistan and to develop more sort of cordial relations economic relations between the two ports, Chabhar and Gwadar, by establishing a rail network. Are these, in your view, significant moves that would affect the relationship between the two in the near future?
Well, the short answer would be yes, but if I want to go longer, as the president of Iran said in the press conference, this can be a turning point in the relations of the both countries. We can see that Iran and Pakistan, based on different reasons, they need and they can have good cooperation on different fields. The first issue is the security issue, or the challenges that the both countries are experiencing in the borders of both countries, and that tells them to cooperate on this issue. And they have said that they will not let any militant or terrorist groups operate from their own soil against the other. So the second issue will be the economic cooperation, as Iran's president said that Iran will increase its electricity export to Pakistan by as much as tenfold. And also he said that Tehran is ready to provide the needs of Pakistan with oil and gas. And the issue of the Islamabad, Tehran and Istanbul transit, that is also important, because that can be a gateway to Europe, and this can connect countries like even China to Europe or other parts of the world. So the political issues also, on the economic issue also, both countries, I think they have the capacity to increase their economic relations by as much as $5 billion per year.
Mr. Sardar, Asif Ali Khan, just quickly getting your closing remarks on how you see Iran and Pakistan will be moving forward after these crucial statements that were made earlier.
You see, much against our own wishes, and I'm sure the wishes in Tehran, there is a built-in limitation to how far we can go with Iran, because of Iran's and the rest of the world, their issues with regard to nuclear, missile, other issues like United States blaming Iran for interference in the region, causing civil wars and whatnot. I mean, we are not a party to that. But we are a victim to that. All this makes it very difficult for us.
I'm sorry, I'll have to cut you short there. I'm out of time. Thank you so much, nonetheless, Mr. Sardar, Asif Ali Khan, and Mr. Aslani, and Mr. Marandi, for your valuable input here on Newswire. With this, we'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. Now, it is being called one of the worst attacks in South Asian history, with the death toll steadily rising. 8 blasts across Sri Lanka has shook the local international community. And this is saying something, considering Sri Lanka has been embroiled in their own armed conflict for almost 30 years. The government versus the Tamil Tigers, which finally came to an end when the Sri Lankan military killed their leader in 2009. Now, what's most disturbing is the degree of sophistication, the planning and the funding that seems to have gone behind these attacks. Both took place on the extreme ends of the island country, one in the east and two in the west. Sri Lanka has relied heavily on tourism, especially in the past 10 years of relative calm. These attacks come at a time where major hotels were attacked and churches were attacked during Easter celebration, and this will clearly affect the tourism industry in Sri Lanka. What's more is that no group or entity has yet taken responsibility. Facebook, WhatsApp, other social media outlets have been shut down by the government to prevent communal violence stirred from unbridled fake news. The situation is tense, and as the story develops, we will go behind the scenes to understand the context in which such horrifying acts of violence have taken place. I'd like to welcome my guests here. We have with us Easwaran Rutnam. He is a journalist joining us from Colombo, and Mr. Chandima Gamage, a parliamentarian, also joining us from Colombo. Thank you so much for giving us your time here on Newswire. I can't begin to tell you how horrifying the attacks are, how strongly we condemn them. These took place distributed across Sri Lanka. We saw them on the east end, we saw them on the west end. Mr. Ratnam, what do you think this signifies? Is there any significance of the location of these attacks?
Well, the significance, I would think, with the location of the attacks, specifically in Colombo, would be that this is an impact on tourism, because the three hotels that were attacked are located very much close to each other. They are in a zone which is filled up with tourists. So this incident does give a bad reputation, not a bad reputation, but it would definitely impact tourism. And the fact that most of the attacks were targeting Colombo, since two churches, at least one church was in Colombo, the other one was close to the main airport. So all this gives the impression that it was systematic, and it was targeting not just a certain religious community, but certainly the industry, tourism industry as a whole as well.
Mr. Ratnam, I understand you were in Colombo when this terrible incident, these bomb blasts went off. Could you tell me a little about the first one? Were you there? What were you doing? Give us an idea of what your day turned out to be like.
I was at church at the time this incident happened, at not one of the churches that were attacked, but one of the main churches in Colombo. And as soon as the first bombing took place, all the churches were told to close their gates, and worshippers were told to go back home. And then what we heard later on since was that a bomb had exploded at one of the main hotels, and then subsequently another hotel, and then a third hotel. And these hotels were hosting Easter events, Easter brunches. And that's where there was a large crowd at most of these hotels. The two targets, the main one was at Shangri-La, and the other one, the Cinnamon Grand Hotel. These are two popular hotels in Colombo. And the explosions took place at their main restaurants. And they were hosting events, Easter events. And that's why this connection between the likelihood of this targeting a certain religious community is being mentioned, is because apart from the churches that were attacked during Easter Mass, these hotels were attacked at the time they were hosting Easter events.
Easter brunch. So it seems like there is one commonality, and that is pointing the finger towards this could be an attack on a religious based attack. But besides that, we have not seen any kind of reports where we can get concrete evidence that this is who is behind this attack, though 24 different arrests have taken place of those who are connected. What is the word on the street? What is the general understanding there of who could be responsible? Because a lot of news is coming out of India pointing the fingers towards Islamic groups.
Well, the reason India is pointing fingers at some Islamic groups is because of some of the attention that is coming out from Sri Lanka itself right now. In fact, the big story in Colombo at this moment is that two government ministers have come out openly at a public press conference and said that there was prior information of these attacks taking place. There was a prior warning. There was an intelligence report that was circulating. The authorities had just yesterday, that's a few hours after this explosion, said that there was no such intelligence report. But now they're saying that there was an intelligence report and that this was not taken seriously by the authorities concerned. And this intelligence report mentions a name of an Islamic organization. This organization has supposedly been planning out these attacks, targeting churches and certain diplomatic missions, including the Indian High Commission. As a result, there is a lot of anger right now as to why, if there was such a report, why prior action was not taken.
Air Marshal Shahzad Chaudhry, defense analyst, joining us from Islamabad. Welcome to Newsbar again. What, in your opinion, could be the reason behind or the intention behind these terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka?
Well, my judgment is that it's going to be most likely determined as an extrinsic or an external influenced event, simply because of the fact that within Sri Lanka, the triggers or the instigators for such a event to take place or for such a violence to occur had stopped existing for the last about 10 years now, ever since the war was over and Sri Lanka had found peace. So I think now there are many reasons why I say that. Of course, the first is the amount of external influence within Sri Lanka, especially that of China. There is, of course, a conference to be held in China on the Belt and Road Initiative, and Sri Lanka and its port in Hambantota are a very, very important part of that. And China has, perhaps to some, an exaggerated influence in Sri Lanka's political and social fabric. So that's also there in many ways. So that could be a reason to upstage what China has put in place in terms of a BRI or the Belt Road Initiative. That is one. Secondly, of course, is the fact that I don't know what are the initial reports, but if there is an external hand, it could be of an organization, something like Daesh. I hope not. But people have been mentioning that since yesterday, especially on Western media.
Right.
If that be the case, then such like activities can also perhaps be generated, or it can generate some sympathy there.
Right. Air Marshal, you've been present in Sri Lanka in various official positions. You spent quite a lot of time there. You were the former High Commissioner there. What is your sense of how the different sort of ethnic and religious backgrounds that people have, the diverse community, how do they mingle, especially in those 10 years following the fall of the Tamil Tigers?
Yeah. Just keep in mind that the ethnic composition of Sri Lanka is very specific in the sense that it has about 75 to 80% Sinhala Buddhists. It has Tamil Hindus and some Muslims, Tamil Muslims as well. But the Tamil as such, as a population, is about 7 to 8% of the population. The Muslims are about 12% of the population. So that sort of makes up the major ethnic composition of the social fabric in Sri Lanka. Now, this year, Sri Lanka celebrated, in a way, 10 years of its victory against the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE, against which they fought, or against whom they fought for good about 25 years, 28 years of their national life. So that was a very important event. Now, I really can't say. Sometimes many things just get together, collect, accumulate, and create a multifaceted effect on it. For example, is it something of a reminder from the Tamil defeat of 10 years back? Is that a message that has been given? And in that, China also gets affected. The BRI gets affected. So I see that happening. The Muslims, who are about 12%, are again an important factor there, but they've always sort of shed away or shied away from any extremism. And that extremism is essentially because of the fact that they're poor, number one. Number two, they are politically active wherever they are, but dependent on the Sinhala Buddhists to sponsor them or support them. So I don't find that kind of extremism taking root within the Muslims, taking root in Sri Lanka. I doubt that's going to be a possibility, though the possibility of someone externally triggering such an action is quite possible, which can then be blamed onto the Muslims of Sri Lanka, and then a civil strife created there.
Right. And Mr. Rutnam, it's a big question when it comes to considering external factors. If we look into the past, on those bloody years during the Sri Lankan civil war with the Tamils, I mean, India had a crucial role to play in not only just equipping, but also training these Tamil militants.
Yeah, that's right. India was accused of training these Tamil militants during the war. And India was also accused of failing to ensure that they put pressure on the Tamil militants to end the war. India was always seen by the Sinhalese majority in Colombo as a country which supported the militants and which supported the ideology of the militants, although their own Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, was assassinated by the Tamil Tigers. But this incident that just happened in Colombo is seen as something totally out of the box. It was not expected.
It was not expected, or there was information that was available, as I mentioned earlier.
So what's happening here is that you might be aware that there was a sort of a political crisis in Sri Lanka last October, where there was a division rising between the Prime Minister and the President, and that division still remains. So right now, this whole incident is being made as a political issue as well, because we are having members of, I'm sorry to say, even one of your guests, Mr. Gamage, his party is coming out and attacking the President, saying that the President had this information with him, that the IGP had the information with him, but this was not shared with the Prime Minister. But as civilians, as ordinary people, as far as they are concerned, there is one government. The President is heading the government. So how can one say that the President had the information and this information was not shared?
That would put the President in a lot of trouble if it were to be proven. And considering that tensions are already high with him and the Prime Minister, if this information was available and why nothing was done about it. But Air Marshal, just the way it was carried out, strategically, coordinated, and obviously a lot of funding went behind it. Is this something unprecedented in Sri Lanka's history? Analysts, critics around the world are calling it one of the worst in South Asia. I mean, the numbers, the death toll is over 200 now. In fact, 290 last I checked.
As a singular event, it surely is very surprising, and especially for a Sri Lanka that had now pacified considerably. Keep in mind, there have been two earlier waves of terror-related insurgencies in Sri Lanka. One in the 70s, which was actually initiated by the ultra-rightist Sinhala Buddhists themselves. And that is when the Tamils and the Muslims both were targeted within Colombo. But for 300 people to be killed on one day in such a synchronized event is almost an impossibility, other than the fact that it was too, it could not have been triggered by a political intent solely. Now, someone can begin to use it for political advantage or political purpose, and that is the nature of politics anywhere in the world. But knowing Sri Lanka well, I don't think that this kind of a thing could have been actually conceived as a political purpose or a political objective. So I don't look at it that way. I think it is essentially a terror incident meant to perhaps serve many external causes and perhaps to also destabilize Sri Lanka in this way that perhaps some apprehensions that have been held in the neighborhood of Sri Lanka are perhaps defeated. Those apprehensions can really be taken care of by enacting such a thing. It could be far-fetched at the moment, but possibly it cannot be. It's my belief it cannot be done within Sri Lanka. It has to have an external trigger, external financing, external planning, and externally motivated. I don't think it is entirely something to do with Sri Lankan society or politics.
Mr. Rutnam, would you agree with this analysis that it definitely has an external trigger?
Well, the Prime Minister himself had said today that they are looking at the possibility of this having an external hand. He was not specific on where they're looking at and if they're suspecting any organization, but he did say that they are looking at the possibility of some external involvement in this incident.
And also, one of the names that are coming up of the organization is the National Tawheed Jamaat, a little-known group generally, but having a ideology that promotes Islamic terrorism.
Yeah, that's right. So that organization has been in existence for some time, but has not been widely spoken of. So this intelligence report mentions this group and does warn that they would carry out suicide attacks on churches and diplomatic missions. But why that report was not taken seriously, if they felt like in the past there had been some concerns raised about certain extremist groups in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka has not been known for Muslim or Islam-related extremist groups operating. It has always been a case where Buddhist groups, Buddhist extremists have been attacking Muslims and churches as well.
In fact, just last year in Kandy, there was a wave of violence where Buddhist Sinalis attacked a lot of Muslim shops and home fronts. Is that true? That maybe this is not just a violence perpetuated in a minority conflict, but a general threat to the Buddhist Sinalis that they're facing from other minorities?
Yeah, so the tensions were always between the Buddhists and the Muslims, Buddhist extremist groups at least, not the general public. But Buddhist extremist groups had always targeted mosques and Muslim establishment or Muslim-owned establishments. And now this is something new, that this has resulted in a situation where there is at least some sort of tensions between Muslims and Christians.
Right.
So it's a case where now the minorities are, facing themselves of having to be at, not at war, but at some sort of odds with other minorities in Sri Lanka.
So let me closing remarks from you, Air Marshal. Since it's our last minute, I just want to wrap up your idea of whether this could be a religious, could have some religious elements into it, considering that even the Jamaat that has been named here, where suspicion is falling, is a very unknown and small, insignificant entity in Sri Lanka.
Like I said, I mean, you can utilize any local hand to achieve the purpose or a grander scheme that you have enacted or thought of. Now, who are the sponsors? Who are the controlling hands of this particular Jamaat? I mean, by itself, it does not serve any purpose for the Muslims of Sri Lanka. The Muslims are unlikely to ever dominate the Sinhala Buddhists there. It's an impossibility because they're totally outnumbered. They cannot outdo them in any manner. That has not been the history of Sri Lanka. So that's also an impossibility. So it's barely, if it is true, it is barely serving someone else's intent and interest. Now, who is that someone else is the most important thing to decipher. And let me just add one more thing. I think Sri Lanka is always shy of naming a very large India on its northern borders. It's always been the case, and I don't blame them for that. But unfortunately, the hands that are in play there are far too bigger than Sri Lanka's own capacity to even identify and point out, even when they have very clear doubts about a particular country.
All right, Air Marshal, thank you so much for your time, and also Mr. Rutnam for giving your insight here on Newswire. Fortunately, that's all the time we have. We'll have to wrap up here and see you next time. Till then, goodbye.